Unknowingly, however, the magazine paid our military services an excellent compliment, for we had long bent every effort to conceal from foreign observation our actual military strength. In this respect, we were obviously most successful. Our Navy's chief training grounds were not in the homeland, but far at sea, where even our own people remained unaware of the true extent of air-sea manoeuvres. Further, we concealed in every possible fashion the particulars of our military weapons and especially the performance of our aircraft. Foreign observers saw only what we allowed them to see. So effective was our armaments censorship that prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, not a single American publication realized the existence of the Zero fighter, and not until several months following the opening of hostilities did the American public receive even a reasonably accurate impression of this airplane. Again, we determined the trend of American thought by observing in another magazine, published several months before December of 1941, that the Japanese Navy's Air Force consists of 4 aircraft carriers with 200 planes. In his memoirs, Winston Churchill testified to the effectiveness of our military censorship and to the erroneous impressions of our air power held both by England and America. Referring to the Battle of Malaya fought on December 10, 1941, during which our planes sent to the bottom the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, Churchill defended the actions of Vice Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, who dispatched the ships under his command to the sea off Kuantan without fighter plane cover. On the basis of all data available to Admiral Phillips, Saigon, the Japanese base nearest to Kuantan, lay more than 400 nautical miles to the north, and the Admiral had every reason to believe that no torpedo bomber then in existence could carry out a mission over this distance. Admiral Phillips was of course in error, as we demonstrated so clearly by destroying the 2 mighty battleships. As Churchill himself stated, both England and America greatly underestimated the battle capabilities of our warplanes. This contributed greatly to the success of our operations. The unforgivable error of underestimating the enemy made by the Americans and the British was perhaps best illustrated in the reliance placed upon the antiquated Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighter plane, which American aviation experts boasted was the most powerful fighter plane in the Orient, and a fighter plane far superior to anything in the Japanese Air Force. Against the Zero fighters, the Buffalo pilots literally flew suicide missions. On the first day of the war, we jammed the message rooms, anxiously awaiting the initial combat reports which would inform us of initial victory or of setbacks. Our exuberance rose steadily as an unending stream of radio messages described the courageous and amazing victories won by our naval air units. My apprehension faded with the increasing number of reported victories. Incredibly, the first hours of war were totally in our favour. The evening of December 8th, Commander Ikegami, the senior staff officer of our air flotilla, returned from Navy General Headquarters in Tokyo with detailed combat reports. From these, we learned that Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the 1st Air Fleet's task force of 376 planes, 108 Zeros, 126 Type 99 dive bombers, and 142 Type 97 carrier-based attack bombers, which attacked the Hawaiian Islands, and that the Navy land-based Air Force of 566 planes, 224 Zeros, 288 Type 1 and Type 96 land-based attack bombers, 30 Type 99 land-based reconnaissance planes, and 24 Type 97 flying boats, of the 11th Air Fleet under Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, was in the Malayan and Philippines theatres of operations, flying from bases in Formosa, southern French Indochina, and Palau. Coordinating their attacks with Admiral Tsukahara's forces and the 4th Carrier Division under Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuda operating in the Davao area, the planes of Rear Admiral Eiji Goto's 24th Air Flotilla flew from their Marianas and Marshall Islands bases to lash out at Wake and Guam. Without exception, every combat report recorded only smashing victories. Our successes exceeded by far even the most optimistic pre-attack estimates. In all military history, I do not know of any country which simultaneously launched so many battles of such magnitude, and in addition, so completely defeated its opponents as we did on that fateful morning of December 8, 1941. We coordinated our combat operations across a distance of 6,000 nautical miles, spanning the ocean between Hawaii and Singapore. What I would like history most to record, however, is that this abrupt reversal of the Asiatic-Pacific balance of power was accomplished with the total of only approximately 1,000 planes of the Japanese Naval Air Force, and that this same force suffered only the barest minimum of losses. An excellent evaluation of our available naval air power may best be had by referring to the air strength hurled by the Allies against Europe in the Normandy invasion. More than 11,000 aircraft. The initial anxiety of the Japanese people changed to wild joy when they learned of our astonishing military gains. Our own Air Force personnel jubilantly cheered each new message of conquest. To be perfectly honest, I personally was astounded at the enemy's inexplicably weak resistance. We expected our forces to fight hard and to achieve a certain minimum of successes, but prior to the attack, no one would have dared to anticipate the actual results of our initial assaults. Despite our brilliant gains, however, I and several other senior officers with a more intimate knowledge of the long-range consequences of the new war could not help but harbour anxiety as to the future of our nation. I remember clearly the special reactions of our young officers, who clamoured for combat duty. The war was hardly more than a month old when rumours spread among the personnel of the air flotilla that before long the war would end in a smashing victory for Japan. Front-line duty appealed much more to these young pilots than did the prosaic training duties of the home air flotillas, and they thought of nothing but their own participation in air battles. We could not disabuse these over-enthusiastic youngsters of their belief that the war would end too quickly for them to try their mettle against the enemy. We stressed the tremendous industrial potential of our adversaries, but with no effect. Our junior pilots were fully convinced that the war would end too soon to enable them to participate. The Pearl Harbor attack, overwhelming victory as the war begins. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a military feat so daring and so successful as to deserve a special place in history. In a single masterful stroke, Japan not only launched the opening phase of the Pacific War, but wrought mass devastation through the powerful American fleet, which was caught unaware in the Hawaiian Islands. The success of this attack stemmed directly from the brilliant planning and the decisive measures taken by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, who for the 18 years prior to the Pacific War had, with a fervour amounting almost to religion, devoted all his efforts to the end of creating a powerful Japanese naval air force. When our intelligence tabulated the final results of the Hawaiian operation, this was its official designation, we discovered that the surprise attack had inflicted far greater damage to the American warships in Hawaii than our most optimistic advance estimates had anticipated. The crippling of a large and powerful segment of the American fleet placed Japan's naval units in a position of strength sufficient to permit our rapid movement elsewhere throughout the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The great majority of Americans will undoubtedly be surprised to learn that the Pearl Harbor assault was not intended to be a sneak blow, although it has come to be accepted in the public mind as such. The conditions and timing of the attack, as related to diplomatic activities conducted simultaneously in Washington, D.C., unhappily created a situation in which it appeared our Navy deliberately struck without any prior notice of hostilities. This unfortunate eventuality occurred despite the fact that the Japanese government had forwarded an ultimatum to the United States through the Japanese embassy in Washington. Although the ultimatum was dispatched to the embassy in sufficient time to permit translation and delivery to the State Department prior to the actual attack, the Japanese embassy's inexcusable delay in making the translation resulted in delivery of the message after our planes had commenced their attack. Actually, this statement does not embody any unusual revelation, since the truth has already been revealed during the international war criminal trials at Tokyo. The writer wishes, however, to set the record straight in these pages. The Hawaiian operation was carried out under the direct command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who was given command of a special carrier task force for the Pearl Harbor operation. The attacking fleet was composed of 23 vessels, including 6 aircraft carriers. These were the Akagi and the Kaga of the 1st Carrier Division, the Soryu and the Hiryu of the 2nd Carrier Division, and the Zuikaku and the Shokaku of the 5th Carrier Division. Augmenting the carrier force were the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, the 2 heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and other vessels. On November 22, 1941, while United States-Japanese diplomatic talks were underway, the Nagumo force gathered at Hitokapu Bay on Itorafu Island, in the southern part of the Kuril Arch. All commanding officers assembled for special meetings with Admiral Nagumo, who took special pains to outline his plans for the attack, which would be launched should negotiations fail. At this time, no definite date for the assault was set. The final disposition and schedule for battle, should there be any, would be determined by the outcome of the diplomatic maneuvers going on in the American capital. On November 26, according to plan, the warships and supporting vessels of the Nagumo force weighed anchor and slipped out of Hitokapu Bay. Under strict secrecy, the task force set sail for its position north of Hawaii, whence, should it prove necessary, the attack would be launched against Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto personally directed the sailing order to Admiral Nagumo. Even as the fleet made its way across the northern Pacific waters, the diplomatic negotiations in Washington foundered. The Japanese government felt that the worst possible international situation had resulted. On December 2, 1941, Admiral Yamamoto dispatched new orders to Admiral Nagumo. The date for the declaration of war is fixed for December 8. Upon receipt of his combat orders, Admiral Nagumo ordered the carrier task force to increase speed and to prepare for battle. Early on the morning of December 8th, the attacking force reached its destination, approximately 200 nautical miles north of Oahu Island. At 1:30 a.m., Tokyo time, the first bombers roared off their carrier decks, bound for Pearl Harbor. At exactly 3:23 a.m., Tokyo time, on December 8th, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida of the Akagi, Supreme Air Commander of the Pearl Harbor Attack Air Groups, issued the following order to all his pilots in the air over or approaching Pearl Harbor. All aircraft immediately attack enemy positions. Commander Fuchida then sent a wireless report to Admiral Nagumo. We have succeeded in the surprise attack. These 2 wireless messages were the signals for raising the curtain of war all across the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. Immediately thereafter, Japanese air fleets launched their attacks against enemy installations over a front of thousands of miles. The fundamental rule of any air battle is to gain immediate control of the local air by eliminating the defensive activities of enemy fighter planes. This precept was rigidly adhered to in the Pearl Harbor attack. Under Commander Fuchida's control, Lieutenant Akira Sakamoto led 25 Type 99 (VAL) dive bombers of the first attacking wave in a screaming assault on Hoyle Air Base. Before the attack, Japanese intelligence had reported that Hoyle was the main center of American fighter plane operations in Hawaii. Lieutenant Sakamoto's mission was designed to eliminate fighter opposition before the American planes could leave the ground. Immediately behind Sakamoto's group came 26 dive bombers under the command of Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi. Takahashi's planes swarmed over Hickam Airfield, which was reported to be the major heavy bomber base for the enemy Army Air Force. Simultaneously, a portion of the Takahashi attacking force was diverted for an attack against Ford Island. The latter was reported as a base for Navy carrier fighters, and Takahashi's attacking wave effectively shattered the enemy's fighter strength. While a few enemy planes managed to get off the ground, our attacking aerial forces were relatively free from enemy fighter opposition, and our fleet was now protected from an American aerial counterattack. As the dive bombers plunged from the sky, Commander Fuchida's level and torpedo bombers assaulted the enemy battleships anchored in the harbour. Under Commander Fuchida's direct control were 49 Type 97 carrier-based attack bombers. Coordinated with this bombing effort was the torpedo bombing assault of 40 Type 97 carrier-based attack bombers under the leadership of Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata. As the dive bombers, level bombers, and torpedo bombers carried out their attacks, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led 43 Zero fighters in a low-level strafing sweep, shooting up enemy anti-aircraft positions, ground installations, planes, and ships in the harbour. The Zeros intercepted and destroyed 4 enemy fighters, which had managed to leave the ground during the attack and which were attempting to disrupt the bombing operations. 1 hour and 15 minutes after the first attacking force ripped into the American naval bastion, the second wave of 170 aircraft under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki of the Zuikaku reached the attack position above Oahu. Commander Shimazaki's 54 level bombers pounded the enemy fighter and bomber air bases. Immediately afterward, Lieutenant Commander Takashige Agusa's 80 dive bombers plunged earthward and sent their missiles into the anchored battleships and other enemy warships. 36 Zero fighters led by Lieutenant Saburo Shindo in a combination strafing and airstrike mission swept the air clear of opposing enemy fighters and carried out strafing attacks against the air bases. By approximately 8:50 a.m., all our planes had completed their attacks and had returned to their respective aircraft carriers. Chief Flight Petty Officer Juzo Mori of the Soryu flew the second torpedo bomber in the attack led by Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Nagai. This is Juzo Mori's story. The assigned objectives of the Soryu torpedo bombers were the American battleships which we expected to find anchored along the wharf of the Oahu Naval Arsenal. We dropped in for our attack at high speed and low altitude, and, when I was almost in position to release my own torpedo, I realized that the enemy warship toward which I was headed was not a battleship at all, but a cruiser. My flight position was directly behind Lieutenant Nagai, and we flew directly over Oahu Island before descending for our attack. Lieutenant Nagai continued his torpedo run against the cruiser, despite our original plan to attack the enemy battleships. However, I did not expect to survive this attack, since I and all the other pilots anticipated heavy enemy resistance. If I were going to die, I thought, I wanted to know that I had torpedoed at least an American battleship. The attack of the Soryu's planes was met with intense anti-aircraft fire from the enemy fleet, since the bombing waves from the Akagi and the Kaga had already passed over. My bomber shook and vibrated from the impact of enemy machine gun bullets and shrapnel. Despite my intention of swinging away from the cruiser, now dead ahead of my plane, and attacking the group of battleships anchored near Ford Island, I was forced to fly directly forward into a murderous rain of anti-aircraft fire. Because of this and the surrounding topography, I flew directly over the enemy battleships along Ford Island, and then banked into a wide left turn. The anti-aircraft fire did not seem to affect the plane's performance, and I chose as my new objective a battleship anchored some distance from the main group of vessels which were at the moment undergoing torpedo attack from the Soryu's planes. The warship separated from the main enemy group appeared to be the only battleship yet undamaged. I swung low and put my plane into a satisfactory torpedoing position. It was imperative that my bombing approach be absolutely correct, as I had been warned that the harbour depth was no more than 34 feet. The slightest deviation in speed or height would send the released torpedo plunging into the sea bottom, or jumping above the water, and all our effort would go for naught. By this time I was hardly conscious of what I was doing. I was reacting from a habit instilled by long training, moving like an automaton. 3,000 feet, 2,500 feet, 2,000 feet. Suddenly the battleship appeared to have leapt forward directly in front of my speeding plane. It towered ahead of the bomber like a great mountain peak. Prepare for release. Stand by. Release torpedo. All this time I was oblivious of the enemy's anti-aircraft fire and the distracting thunder of my plane's motor. I concentrated on nothing but the approach and the torpedo release. At the right moment I pulled back on the release with all my strength. The plane lurched and faltered as an anti-aircraft struck the wings and fuselage. My head snapped back, and I felt as though a heavy beam had struck against my head. But I've got it. A perfect release. And the plane is still flying. The torpedo will surely hit its target. The release was exact. At that instant I seemed to come to my senses and became aware of my position and of the flashing tracers and shells of the enemy's defensive batteries. After launching the torpedo, I flew directly over the enemy battleship and again swung into a wide circling turn. I crossed over the southern tip of Ford Island. To conceal the position of our carrier, as we had been instructed to do, I turned again and took a course due south, directly opposite the Soryu's true position, and pushed the plane to its maximum speed. Now that the attack was over, I was acutely conscious that the enemy anti-aircraft fire was bracketing and smashing into my bomber. The enemy shells appeared to be coming from all directions, and I was so frightened that before I left the target area, my clothes were soaking with perspiration. In another few moments the air was clear. The enemy shells had stopped. Thinking that now I had safely escaped and could return to the carrier, I began to turn to head back to the Soryu. Suddenly there was an enemy plane directly in front of me. As my plane, the Type 97 carrier-based attack bomber, was armed only with a single rearward-firing 7.7mm machine gun, it was almost helpless in aerial combat. I thought that surely this time my end had come. As long as I was going to die, I reasoned, I would take the enemy plane with me to my death. I swung the bomber over hard and headed directly for the enemy aircraft, the pilot of which appeared startled at my manoeuvre, and fled. Is this really, I questioned, what is called war? At the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese Naval Air Force had attained what was probably the world's highest rate of accuracy in level-bombing aircraft attacks, including the use of conventional aerial bombs and of aerial torpedoes. The credit for such outstanding accuracy of bomb and torpedo hits, as was dramatically illustrated at Pearl Harbor, as well as in the sea battle off Malaya 2 days later, belongs largely to Admiral Yamamoto. During the period 1939 to 1940, the accuracy of Japanese-level bombers was incredibly poor. It was so bad that it was doubtful whether one hit could be achieved when 3 or 4 groups of 9-plane formations released their bombs from a height of 10,000 feet against an evading battleship-sized target on the open sea. On the other hand, an attack by 3 dive bombers against the same type of objective almost always guaranteed at least one successful hit on target. High official circles were of the opinion that, for attacking warships, dive bombing and torpedoing were the preferred methods of attack. The feeling that level bombing should be eliminated entirely dominated the Navy's air power hierarchy. At this time, Admiral Yamamoto took an active hand in the development of bombing techniques. Recently made Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, he was a Vice Admiral then, Yamamoto firmly declared, "As long as I am the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, I will not do away with level bombing. True, our level bombing accuracy at sea has been poor, but the reason for the poor ratio of bomb hits lies in the free, evasive movement of the target vessel. There is no reason compelling us to select only these difficult targets. At any rate, I hope that much further study and practice will be conducted hereafter." Admiral Yamamoto had also issued the order to pursue and destroy, either at the Singapore Naval Base or on the high seas, the British fleet which was, at the time of the Hawaiian operation, somewhere in the Malaya area. As will be related in later pages, our Naval Air Force in this theatre, under far greater operating difficulties and hazards than were encountered at Pearl Harbor, accomplished a mission no less vital than the Pearl Harbor attack. The fighters and bombers of the Nagumo force, which attacked Pearl Harbor, fought brilliantly and heroically. Within a very short space of time they destroyed the major strength of the United States Pacific Fleet. In this operation our losses consisted of 9 Zero fighters, 15 Type 99 carrier-based dive bombers, 5 Type 97 carrier-based attack bombers, and 55 officers and men. Among the casualties were Lieutenant Saburo Makino, group leader of the Kaga's dive bombers, and Lieutenant Fusata Oida, squadron leader of Zero fighters from the Soryu. Lieutenant Ida participated in the Pearl Harbor attack as the leader of the 3rd Covering Fighter Squadron, composed of 9 Zero fighters, which struck in the 2nd attacking wave. Near the Kaneohe airfield, his squadron, with the aid of accompanying fighter units, intercepted 5 or 6 enemy planes and quickly destroyed them all. They then strafed the airfield, shooting up all enemy aircraft in sight. Lieutenant J.G. Iyozo Fujita, who participated with Lieutenant Ida in the attack as the 2nd section leader, relates what happened to Lieutenant Ida's plane during the assault. When our planes machine-gunned the airfield at Kaneohe, I looked for but failed to see any anti-aircraft guns on the field. Later, however, when all the fighters assembled their formations over the field, I noticed a white spray of gasoline shooting out from Lieutenant Ida's plane. There appeared to be no other damage to his fighter, and I assumed he would be able to return to the carrier. Such was not the case, however. Lieutenant Ida circled over the Kaneohe airfield until he was sure that all our fighters were assembled in formation. Then, and only then, he closed his cockpit canopy and began to descend toward the airfield. Suddenly, the Zero whipped over into an inverted position and dove vertically for the enemy positions below. Thinking that he was going to make another strafing run on the field, I immediately began a wing-over to follow his plane down. I realized abruptly, however, that Lieutenant Ida was flying in a most unusual manner, quite different from his usual tactics. I watched his plane as it dove in its vertical, inverted position until it exploded on the ground between the Kaneohe airfield hangars. Thus died one of Japan's leading fighter pilots on the first day of the war. Lieutenant Ida had flown as a Zero fighter pilot since September of 1939 and had fought successfully against Chinese fighters over the Asiatic mainland. He was 27 years old when he died and was the highest-ranking officer among the Nagumo Forces fighter pilots to die to this day. After the war, Okumiya, had the opportunity to carefully review the American photographs of the Pearl Harbor attack. In one picture, I saw the funeral ceremony at Pearl Harbor of an Air Force lieutenant of the Japanese Navy. It was not possible to discern from the photographs any difference in the burial services afforded the American dead and those given to the Japanese lieutenant. I point this out especially, since those Americans were killed because of a Japanese air attack in which this Japanese lieutenant participated. We, all former Japanese airmen, should take heed of this fact, and long remember the attitude of the American officers and men who did not make any discrimination between their own and the enemy's officers, even after such an event as the Pearl Harbor attack. Following the final assault against the enemy installations at Hawaii, Commander Fuchida, the Supreme Air Commander of the operation, returned safely to his aircraft carrier with the 2nd Attack Force. Lieutenant Masaharu Suganami, group leader of the Soryu's Zero fighters, left his carrier at 1:30 a.m. when the Japanese fleet was still 200 nautical miles north of Oahu. After convoying the bombers of the first attacking wave and strafing the enemy's airfield, he remained alone over Oahu Island and joined the 2nd attack group in its assault. He returned to his carrier at approximately 8:30 a.m. From such incidents, we can well appreciate the high quality and air combat superiority of the officers and men of the Nagumo force. This was their first introduction to air-sea combat on a large scale, and the men and planes accomplished their tasks magnificently. Thus ended successfully the greatest aerial operation ever seen up to this time. In a single smashing blow, a total of 353 planes from 6 aircraft carriers completely wrecked the powerful battleship fleet of the United States. This feat astounded the entire world. Who would have thought up to this time that the Japanese Navy, without firing a single shot from its guns, would be able to destroy almost completely, and within such a short time, the powerful dreadnoughts of the United States Pacific Fleet? The battleship had long been regarded as the king of the sea. Ever since the birth of the modern Navy, the battleship had reigned supreme in America's fleet. And this same fleet, which, with only 8 battleships, had been holding the Japanese Navy at a distance of more than 3,000 nautical miles, now lay crushed and useless as the result of a single telling air blow. What is most amazing about the Hawaiian operation is that of the 353 planes launched by the Nagumo force to attack Pearl Harbor, only 154 planes were assigned to attack the American warships. The remaining 199 aircraft were dispatched to strafe and bomb the enemy airfields, to destroy on the ground and in the air any enemy aircraft, to the end that the attacking Japanese force might have undisputed local air superiority. If the American Air Force had detected in advance the approach of the Japanese fighters and bombers and had thrown up an air defense of fighter planes, our accomplishments would surely have been lessened and our losses increased. It is conceivable that, had Pearl Harbor been protected by air defenses, the assault against Hawaii could have lost much of its effectiveness and the nature of the Pacific War proportionally altered. Zero fighters assure victories. Operations in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. The nature of the Hawaiian operation prevented the Zero fighters from demonstrating fully their exceptional combat performance. Our planes so quickly eliminated all enemy aerial opposition that the Zeros confined their sweeps mainly to strafing attacks. In the Philippine Islands and the Dutch East Indies campaigns, however, our success rested directly on the ability of the Zero fighters to establish control of the air. Neither campaign could possibly have achieved its success with a fighter plane of lesser performance than the new Zero, which so completely surprised the enemy. Our main land-based air strength lay in Formosa, to which our planes flew immediately prior to the war. Separating these bombers and fighters from crucial Clark and Iber fields on Luzon was the impressive distance of more than 450 nautical miles. We considered these two bases, as well as the city of Manila, which lay some 500 nautical miles from Formosa, as targets of the highest priority. Our intelligence reported that at Clark and Iber fields rested the bulk of American air power in the Philippines. It was necessary to destroy this if our operations were to proceed with any degree of safety. This distance between our Formosa bases and the Philippine Islands created a tremendous obstacle. Our planes in China often flew long missions, especially between Hankow and Chungking, but the proposed Formosa to Philippines and return raids exceeded even the most strenuous flights of the Sino-Japanese incident. Further complications arose from the fact that the greater portion of the Formosa-Philippines flight would have to be made over water, which increased the possibilities of navigational error. Even were these obstacles to be overcome, we still faced the hazards of excessive bomber losses, since the distances involved appeared far beyond the maximum capabilities of our fighter planes. The Chinese, with inferior fighters, had effectively defended their cities against our unescorted bomber formations, and we realized only too well that the superior caliber of American pilots and planes promised severe bomber losses. It was possible that in the Zero we possessed the world's first fighter airplane capable of flying the 900 nautical miles for the round trip between Formosa and Luzon. Actually, we would have to provide for the equivalent of at least 1,300 nautical miles of flight, since the Zeros would inevitably be called on to engage in fuel-consuming dogfights. We also had to consider additional factors. The effective flight range of an airplane is determined by more than merely still air flight. The size of the formations would in great part determine the eventual fuel consumption of our planes, and much would depend upon our pilots' flying skill. Experience had taught us that a pilot well versed in the art of flying by the seat of his pants could extend by a considerable margin the maximum range of his airplane, as compared to the individual who flew mechanically. In China, we always realized maximum efficiency from our formations and were assured that our men possessed the highest flying skill. Circumstances then permitted us to select for Zero fighter operations only our crack pilots, and our formation flights never exceeded in size the 30-0 mission against Chengdu. Once we placed the Zero in mass production and assigned large numbers to operational fleet units, we forfeited the luxury of critical pilot selection. Our commitment to a decisive war with America and England demanded the use of every available Zero fighter against the enemy, although we might lack what we considered a desirable number of crack pilots. Consequently, in the summer of 1941, we assigned to our aircraft carriers half of those pilots who had fought in China under Lieutenant Saburo Shindo's command. The remaining veterans, under Lieutenant Tamotsu Yokoyama's leadership, were transferred to the land-based air forces. Thus, the difficulties of the Formosa Philippines operation mounted steadily. To raid Luzon with Zero fighter planes, we were required to use the relatively few seasoned pilots as a nucleus, around which we built a force of nearly 250 Zero fighters, including spare planes which we assigned to the Tainan and the 3rd Air Corps. The magnitude of the forthcoming Luzon assault demanded that we employ larger fighter plane formations than we had ever sent into combat. The difficulties of maintaining formation with large groups of airplanes complicate the pilot's efforts to maintain minimum fuel consumption. The mass formations inevitably resulted in a reduction in the Zero's operating radius of action. Perhaps our greatest worry lay in the fact that the American and Philippine forces would expect our attack and consequently would be able fiercely to resist our planes with a maximum number of interceptors. Since we were to open the war with the Hawaiian operation, the Philippines would have ample time in which to bolster their defences. The unfavourable timing demanded that we attack Luzon with every available airplane. Everything depended upon the ability of the Zero fighters to wrest control of the local air from the defenders. Cognizant of our difficulties, the General Staff in Tokyo and the Combined Fleet General Staff ordered every possible action taken to increase the flight endurance of the Zero fighters in Formosa. Again, we were faced with a problem other than that of range. We had to calculate the effect upon our pilots of the long hours spent in the air within the small Zero cockpits. Our pilots must engage American fighters after spending what we considered was a prohibitive number of flying hours before entering combat. In early October of 1940, 3 small aircraft carriers, the Ryujo, Zuiho, and Kasuga Maru, arrived in southern Formosa. We commenced special deck takeoff and landing training, for our plan was to move the carriers as close as possible to Luzon before launching our attack in the Philippines. By so doing, we would reduce effectively the time spent in the air by our fighter pilots. Further, our planes would not have to take off in early morning darkness to coordinate their attack with that of the Nagumo force. There is a difference of 5 hours and 20 minutes in the time of sunrise between Pearl Harbor and Luzon. The carrier operation would allow our planes to attack Luzon, engage in air combat, and return directly to Formosa. Subsequent events forced us to review critically our proposed carrier attack. Our larger carriers were all committed to specific operations for the morning of December 8, 1941, and the 3 carriers assigned to the Philippines campaign were maddeningly slow, had small carrier decks, and could accommodate no more than 75 planes in all. For long months our pilots would be limited to practicing carrier operations, and would never receive the special simulated combat training which they required. The performance of each plane would suffer from the added weight of aircraft carrier operation equipment. In early 1941, there were in Formosa many of Japan's outstanding fighter plane strategists and pilots, including Commander Motoharu Okamura, Commander Yasuna Kozono, Commander Takeo Shibata, Lieutenant Hideki Shingo, and the China veteran, Lieutenant Tamotsu Yokoyama. For months, the renowned flyer Captain Masahisa Saito of the Tainan Air Corps and Captain Yoshio Kame of the 3rd Air Corps drove their pilots near to exhaustion, steadily improving the range of their Zero fighters, increasing the efficiency of formation flights, and extending the flight endurance time of the fighters. Captain Saito and Captain Kame were hard taskmasters. Day after day, they sent their pilots into the air under conditions which exceeded our worst experiences in China. The severe training discipline reaped a golden harvest. Saito's pilots steadily increased the endurance time of their Zeros, ranging further and further in non-stop flights from their home bases. 10-hour flights became routine, then this figure jumped to 11, and finally our fighter pilots flew simulated combat missions of 12 continuous hours in the air. In flights up to and exceeding 10 hours, our pilots reduced their fuel consumption to 21 gallons per hour. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai achieved the amazing fuel consumption of only 18 gallons per hour. The reduction in fuel consumption, with its accompanying greater range and flight endurance, brightened the prospects of the Luzon attack. With a guaranteed minimum of 10 hours of flight time, the Zeros would be able to fly from Formosa to Luzon, combat the American fighters, and return to their home bases with fuel to spare. Our biggest problem was solved. Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, Commander-in-Chief of the 11th Air Fleet and the Commander of Land-Based Air Forces in the Formosa Theatre, informed Navy General Headquarters that the 3 aircraft carriers were no longer required for the Philippines attack. Here was concrete proof that our ceaseless efforts to achieve in the Zero hitherto impossible performance had paid handsome dividends. The fighters' unparalleled range enabled the Navy to relieve the 3 carriers of their intended mission. The Ryujo steamed to Palau Island to join in the campaign against Davao, Mindanao Island, and the Zuiho and Kasuga Maru returned to Japan for other assignments. On the very eve of the impending war, we thus gained the equivalent of 3 vitally important aircraft carriers for our initial thrusts against the enemy. The intended Naval Air Force distribution for the opening of the Philippines campaign on December 8, 1941, was: we assembled at these bases a total of 184 Zero fighters, 192 land-based attack bombers, 120 Type 1 and 72 Type 96, and 24 Type 97 flying boats. Only 108 Zeros and 144 attack bombers were capable of joining the difficult long-range operations. Later, this number diminished even further when we transferred to southern French Indochina approximately half the strength of the Kanoya Air Corps, leaving us with 117 operational attack bombers. Our intelligence selected as priority targets the well-equipped Clark and Iba fields on Luzon Island. We dismissed as unimportant the secondary Nichols Field in the Manila suburbs. Early in the morning of December 8, 1941, thick fog rolled in from the sea completely to shroud our air bases. On the very first day of the war, when a coordinated effort was of the utmost importance, our planes could not leave their fields. We cursed and fumed, for even as we paced helplessly in the swirling gloom, the Nagumo Task Force planes turned Pearl Harbor into a shambles. If the enemy in the Philippines had the opportunity to counterattack quickly, he could disrupt completely our carefully laid plans. Finally, the initial reports of the Pearl Harbor raid reached us through Tokyo. Still, the fog did not lift. After long hours of chaining us to the ground, the fog dispersed before the morning sun. We wasted no time, and, as quickly as their engines could be warmed, the fighters and bombers thundered from the field and headed southward. As the gods of war would have it, the crippling fog proved to be a tremendous asset in our attack against the American air bases. Our planes reached Luzon Island at 1:30 p.m., Tokyo time, several hours later than we had originally scheduled. By this quirk of circumstances, we caught the American fighters completely off guard. Receiving the reports of the Pearl Harbor attack, the fighters took to the air in anticipation of a forthcoming raid. After waiting in vain for several hours for our planes, which were then sitting helplessly on the ground, the enemy planes, their fuel exhausted, returned to their fields. Almost immediately afterward, our fighters and bombers swept in to attack. Admiral Tsukahara's battle report of the day's events follows. On the morning of December 8th, 54 Type 1 land-based attack bombers, the majority of the 1st Air Corps, bombed and destroyed 40 to 50 of the 60 enemy planes on Clark Field. 34 Zero fighters of the Tainan Air Corps, led by Lieutenant Shingo, flew escort. Immediately following completion of the bombing runs, the Zeros descended to treetop level and in sweeping attacks strafed and destroyed almost all the remaining enemy planes. 54 Type 96 land-based attack bombers of the Takao Air Corps, escorted by 50 Zero fighters of the 3rd Air Corps under command of Lieutenant Yokoyama, bombed and destroyed all of approximately 25 planes at Iba Field. Two of our Zero fighter units encountered an estimated 15 enemy planes in the air and in the ensuing battle shot down the entire enemy fighter force. The effectiveness of our attacks has exceeded our fondest expectations. The sweeping raids reduced in a single stroke the major American offensive power in the Philippines. Our intelligence estimated an enemy strength of some 300 airplanes throughout the Philippine Islands on the first day of the war. Our initial attack destroyed at least one-third of this number. The sudden destruction of so large a segment of the air power of the United States, an enemy whom we expected to offer bitter resistance, infected our air crews with the desire to destroy the remaining enemy air force completely. After the war, we learned that the United States Army Air Forces had on Luzon Island on December 8, 1941, 160 planes, including 35 B-17 heavy bombers. Our initial attack destroyed or rendered useless at least 60 of these. On the war's second day, severe storms reduced the effectiveness of our attacking planes. High winds and rain forced several fighters into the sea. On December 10th, however, a savage aerial attack effectively neutralized the Cavite Naval Base area in South Manila. 48 hours later, not a single enemy plane remained on Luzon Island to contest our rampaging Zero fighters. Within these 3 days, the aerial operations against Luzon Island ceased. By the fourth day, December 13th, we dismissed the possibility of any form of enemy aerial counterattack. In 3 days, our Zero fighters had given us absolute aerial supremacy in this theatre of war. At first glance, these successes closely resemble the operations of the German Air Force in its overwhelming victories against Poland and France in the early days of World War II. A closer appraisal of the two air campaigns, notably of the numbers of aircraft employed both by our naval air forces and those of the Luftwaffe, reveals the slim numerical margin with which our forces operated. Ours was a battle resting entirely upon qualitative superiority and tactics, while the Luftwaffe, as can be seen in the accompanying charts, enjoyed both qualitative and overwhelming quantitative advantages. After the beginning of the war, we learned that, although the Zero fighter had appeared in battle in China more than a year prior to December of 1941, the Allies professed astonishment at the sight of our new fighter and were caught completely unaware by the Zero's performance. Months after the Philippines campaign, the Allies still did not realize the true flight capabilities of the Zero. When Zeros raided Port Darwin, Australia, early in 1942, the enemy accepted without question the fact that the Zeros must have flown from our carriers, when in reality they flew from our newly captured land bases on Timor Island. In every operation in December of 1941, we quickly attained numerical as well as qualitative superiority. We fully appreciated the fact that the geographical isolation of the Pacific and Asiatic battle areas would prevent the enemy from rapidly reinforcing his air forces, and that by quick, decisive onslaughts we would not only achieve local air supremacy, but would retain this advantage. Within 10 days of the opening bombing attack, the enemy planes disappeared entirely from the Philippines. Our forces wasted no time in pressing their newly won gains. On December 25th, our task force swarmed ashore on Jolo Island in the southern part of the Sulu Sea and occupied its airfield. To obtain local air coverage, we dispatched 24 Zero fighters of the Tainan Air Corps in a mass non-stop formation flight of 1,200 nautical miles. The flight of the single-seat fighter planes was unprecedented in aviation history. Our fighters experienced little difficulty in ridding the skies of the remaining enemy planes. By early March of 1942, our naval land-based air forces had landed in the string of South Pacific islands. Quickly, the entire Dutch East Indies came under the control of our air force. The Tainan Air Corps advanced to Bali Island in the Dutch East Indies, through Jolo Island, Tarakan, Balikpapan, and Banjarmasin. The 3rd Air Corps flew to Davao, Manado, and Kendari, Celebes, then divided into 2 groups, the first of which advanced through Makassar to Bali Island. The second group moved into Dili on Timor Island by way of Amboina. Under Admiral Tsukahara's command, the the naval land-based air forces in the southern Pacific area definitely shot down in air combat and destroyed on the ground a total of 565 enemy planes from December 8, 1941, until the close of the Java operation. Of this number, our Zero fighters accounted for 471 planes, or 83% of the total. We can judge the effectiveness of our Zero fighters by observing that in all our operations in the first months of the war, the Zero fighters of our land and carrier-based air forces destroyed 65% of all the enemy planes lost. This accomplishment contributed directly to the success of our operations, in many respects, other than the destruction of the enemy aircraft. Without control of the air, our bombers and torpedo planes could not possibly have eliminated enemy resistance so thoroughly. We have stressed, perhaps repetitiously, the role of this one airplane in the initial phases of the Pacific War. We feel, however, that at Pearl Harbor, as well as in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies, we could not possibly have achieved our sea, land, and air victories with a fighter plane of lesser performance than the Zero. Our entire strategy depended upon the success of this aircraft. On December 10, 1941, the third day of the Pacific War, Japan received news of a tremendous victory which greatly affected our future military operations in Pacific and Asiatic waters. Two of England's most powerful warships, the dreadnought Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse of the British Asiatic Fleet, had been sent to the bottom off the Malayan coast. The victory was accomplished without the participation of Japanese surface vessels. 75 twin-engine, land-based attack bombers of the Navy's 22nd Air Flotilla, under the command of Rear Admiral Sadaichi Matsunaga, had carried out the devastating attack and, in a single blow, rendered Britain's Asiatic sea power impotent. Even more dramatically than the Pearl Harbor attack, this action typified the sudden changes in a balance of military power which could be wrought by bombing aircraft. Japan's air power accomplished England's reduction from her position as a major naval power in the Indian Ocean to a state of helplessness at the unbelievably low cost of only 3 bombing airplanes, all of which succeeded in crashing into a British warship as they went down. During the summer of 1941, the 22nd Air Flotilla had been undergoing intensified combat flight training at the Naval Air Force Base in southern Formosa. In late October, the flotilla was ordered to move its headquarters to Saigon, the capital of French Indochina. 2 air corps of the flotilla were simultaneously transferred to new bases. The Genzan Air Corps, consisting of 48 Type 96 land-based attack bombers, moved to Saigon via Hainan Island, and the Mihiro Air Corps, similarly equipped with 48 Type 96 bombers, transferred to Thu Dau Mot, north of Saigon. The flotilla's fighter plane unit, consisting of 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, and the reconnaissance plane unit with 6 Type 98 land-based reconnaissance planes, were moved under direct command of Rear Admiral Matsunaga to the advanced base at Sok Trang, south of Saigon. These air units were specifically charged with destruction of enemy fleet forces and the protection of our troop transports, carrying the Army Malaya Landing Force destruction of the enemy's air forces stationed around Singapore, maintaining a sea patrol. The strategy adopted just prior to the opening of hostilities in the Pacific War called for the Army Air Force to assume air responsibility for this area. At this time, however, the Army Air Force lacked striking power and was almost useless for air combat operations. The Navy had little faith in the ability of Army units to attack with any success the enemy's surface vessels. Indeed, the Army was sadly deficient in the means and the experience with which to carry out overwater military activities. Had the war broken out at this time, October, rather than during the planned date of the first week in December, the Army would not have possessed a single aircraft capable of bombing Singapore, the largest and most powerful British base in the area, from our main base in French Indochina. This deplorable situation prevailed despite the fact that the British fleet and the bombers based at Singapore were considered the greatest menace to the army transports which had been scheduled to carry the army landing force from French Indochina for the invasion of Malaya. Considering the vital objectives at hand, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, personally interceded and ordered the 22nd Air Flotilla to move immediately to its new bases in French Indochina. In late November of 1941, we received intelligence reports stating that 2 British battleships had been sighted moving in an easterly direction through the Indian Ocean. Additional reports from the area indicated later that the 2 warships had arrived at Singapore on December 2nd or 3. It was also determined that the commander of the newly strengthened fleet was Vice Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, and that the 2 large warships were the new King George Thev and the fast battlecruiser Repulse. Subsequent to the action of December 10th, the battleship was identified as the Prince of Wales, of the same class as the King George V, which 6 months previously had played an important role in the sinking of the German dreadnought Bismarck. The Japanese plans for the Malayan invasion were seriously threatened by the unexpected appearance of the 2 powerful British warships in the area. Conservative estimates by our intelligence indicated that the 2 British warships were even more powerful than our fast battleships Kongo and Haruna. Then, under the command of Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, the leading Japanese Navy commander in the theatre and Commander-in-Chief of the Second Fleet. Admiral Kondo had under his direct command not only the 2 battleships, but also 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser and 10 destroyers. In addition to this force, 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 14 destroyers were under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, Commander-in-Chief of the Malaya Force. To support this surface strength, Admiral Yamamoto, when informed of the appearance of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse at Singapore, ordered 27 Type 1 land-based attack bombers of the Kanoya Air Corps, which had been stationed in South Formosa, to move immediately to a new base in French Indochina. They were placed under the command of Rear Admiral Matsunaga. This was the final disposition of our forces in the area, as the scheduled date for initiating the war approached. By the middle of the first week in December, our air, sea and ground forces were poised to strike against the enemy. Our operations involved the taut period of waiting and patrolling. We paid particularly close attention to the movements of the British Asiatic Fleet. Starting early in December, partly for the purpose of tracking the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, we patrolled the ocean waters surrounding French Indochina, Malaya and Borneo daily with land-based attack bombers. Tension among the air units was at a high pitch. To date, all our movements had been carried out successfully, but at any moment the enemy might discover our plans and cause confusion among the closely coordinated activities of our air, sea and land elements. Lieutenant Sado Takai, a squadron leader of the Gensan Air Corps, who participated in the pre-attack sea patrol and later in the Malaya sea battle, kept detailed notes of activities at the time. 2 days before the scheduled date of opening hostilities, we patrolled the ocean as far as 100 nautical miles south of Singapore. Patrol duty was an unpleasant experience. We were a single lonely plane flying through the cloudless skies over the southern sea. My crew uttered hardly a word during these long flights, almost constantly holding their breath, their eyes turned towards Singapore. The great British military base had been set as our target on the first night of the war, in the event that the British fleet should fail to leave the protection of the shore guns. Perhaps my men were carrying out their duties too intently. They seemed to be attempting to gain useful experience from every moment spent in the air during the tedious patrol missions. Everyone in the aircraft was in a confused state of mind, which was caused by the need for constant caution, by anticipation as to what would occur when the fighting began, and by a strong desire to be as proficient as possible in his duties. Not a single vessel or airplane was seen. The sea stretching endlessly before our bomber was so calm that not a wave was visible. It was hardly believable that only 2 days from now the war would start. Full-scale patrol of the ocean area in which the first attacks would take place had commenced several days before the scheduled opening of hostilities. But, as is evident from Lieutenant Takai's detailed report, many of the searching bombers failed to sight any movement on the part of the British fleet or air forces. Some British planes were observed by the Japanese bombers, but without hostile action taken by either side. Lieutenant Takai's report continues. The Navy had ordered that all personnel engaged in search missions were to concentrate on the movement of the two British battleships. We flew our patrols every day, seeing nothing, growing more and more tense as the attack date approached. The nerve-wracking stillness over the ocean might well be described as the calm before the storm. December 6, 1941. The troop transports carrying the Army landing force scheduled to invade the east shores of Malaya were proceeding westward off the South Indochina coast. Troop convoys are always infuriatingly slow in their movement. This phase of the attack operation was the bottleneck in our scheduled invasion of the enemy-held territory. Under constant fighter plane cover, however, the fleet was advancing slowly toward Kota Bharu in Malaya. Fortunately, the sea was calm, and the transports went unobserved, but this Japanese feudal lord procession-like fleet could not remain completely safe forever. On this same day, our worst fears were realized. British flying boat patrol bombers discovered the convoy of troopships. Our entire invasion plan was completely exposed to the enemy long before we were able to launch the invasion of Malaya. It was perfectly clear to the British what a fleet composed of 30 vessels in formation represented, to what area it was headed, and when it would arrive at its destination. We were compelled to immediately change our tactics from secret operation to open movement. The possibility of an enemy aerial attack on our air bases in French Indochina was a cause for grave concern. Immediately we began to disperse our bombing squadrons to bases covering a wider area than they embraced. The day before the opening of the war dawned quietly. We hoped and prayed that the enemy would not take any action. Every radio dispatch was carefully studied for a hint of possible attack. We were worried that the British might attack the troopship convoy. Whenever a long interval went by without receipt of a radio dispatch, we feared we might have missed the news of possible fighting. On the other hand, whenever a radio message was received, we were afraid it would bring bad news. The scope of the area and the size of the forces involved were so great that almost anything could happen. We all wondered if our meticulously laid plans would really succeed. The constant waiting and wondering made sleep almost impossible. My most important duty was to have all my bombers prepared to launch an attack at a moment's notice. The armament we were to carry would, of course, depend upon the object of any attack. If land objectives were to be bombed, then special bomb racks would have to be mounted, because we would carry a large number of small-size bombs. If enemy ships were to be attacked, we would carry either heavy bombs or torpedoes. Unless my airplanes were in constant readiness to be loaded with any of these three types of weapons, they would be useless for the forthcoming air battles, in which even the slightest delay in joining the action could prove disastrous. The ground crews which maintained our planes in combat-ready condition were little known to the public, in contrast to the attention bestowed upon the flight crews. It often happens, however, that the armament and ground crews hold the key to victory or defeat. No sign was received to indicate that the British fleet would leave Singapore to attack our surface vessels. The order was given. We would bomb Singapore on the first night of the war as originally scheduled. The flight crew of every airplane had been trained to perfection. This was our final moment. We had studied the bombing and attack plans so many times we had memorized every detail. Special preparations were unnecessary. Beyond the normal need for mechanical maintenance and the loading of our aircraft with bombs or torpedoes, we were ready to attack. Our only worry was the strength of possible enemy aerial counterattacks. However, as the war was to be opened in this theatre by bombs dropped by our own aircraft, everyone was in high spirits. We were determined to frighten the enemy out of their wits. This was to be our first large-scale naval action, and our concern was not for our safety, but rather how much damage our aerial bombs and torpedoes would inflict on the enemy battleships. December 7th, 1941. The day just before the opening of the war passed quietly and without incident. The British failed to attack. 3 squadrons, 27 planes of the Mihiro Air Corps, and 3 squadrons of the Genzan Air Corps roared from their bases in South Indochina into the black of night for Singapore, as scheduled. The southern sky was filled with cumulonimbus clouds, which were peculiar to this area. My fears of very bad weather were realized when the 27 bombers of the Genzan Air Corps, to which I belonged, suddenly were enveloped in thick clouds as we were climbing. As squadron leader of the 2nd Squadron, I placed my plane at the head of a 9-bomber flight. Visibility was so poor that it was almost impossible to recognize the formation lights of the 2 aircraft immediately behind me. The air was extremely rough, the plane rocked and shook. Sheets of rain drummed on the wings and fuselage and smashed against the cockpit windshield. Without changing course, I began a descent to a lower altitude. Behind me, some high, others low, could be seen the glowing red, green and yellow lights of the bombers in my squadron as they struggled to maintain formation in the rough air. Every now and then great flashes of lightning were reflected from the whirling propeller blades of the bombers. The pilots were trying desperately to hold the group together, so that they would not be left behind or separated from the formation to become lost over the sea. I was still losing altitude when directly below the aircraft there appeared the dull white crests of waves streaking the black ocean surface. I pulled up from the steady descent and searched for the other bombers. Only 2 of the original squadron of 9 were in sight. It seemed almost impossible to reorganize the formation. I was still looking vainly for an area of clear sky amidst the boiling clouds and rain, when a return to base order was received by wireless from Lieutenant Commander Nichi Nakanishi, our wing commander. All bombers returned to their takeoff points. Later that night we received a radio message telling of the successful first bombing attack on Singapore. The Mihiro Air Corps bombers were unobstructed by weather and had carried out their raids as scheduled. Our bomber crews were annoyed and disgusted that, in the first attack of the war, the Genzan Air Corps had not even reached its bombing objective and, because of weather conditions, had been scattered all over the sky. December 8, 1941. This morning it dawned quietly. By some miracle, the enemy had still not attacked our air bases in French Indochina, much to the relief of all pilots and crew members. Our army planes were already active and were carrying out their bombing missions against the enemy forces. It was inconceivable that the enemy would not launch a heavy attack against our airfields, and my squadron moved at once to a nearby French Army airbase. A French Army officer approached my bomber this morning, smiling broadly and speaking rapidly in his native tongue. It had been a long time since I studied French at the Naval Academy, and I was unable to understand a word he was saying. We later discovered that the French officer had been congratulating us for our Navy's successful attack on Pearl Harbor. Until that moment, when we discovered what the excited French officer was trying to tell us, we were unaware of the great assault on the American air and naval bastion. Neither our constant bomber patrols over the ocean, nor the reconnaissance flights over Singapore, had yet discovered any activity by the British battleships. We could not understand what caused the enemy to delay throwing these powerful vessels into action. Today was the most critical phase of our operations. The army troops were scheduled to invade Malaya. Should the British warships or their bombers attack our transports during the assault operation, we might be in serious trouble. The absence of the enemy fleet made us feel that something was amiss, that the British might spring a sudden attack upon us. I know that, had I been the commander of those 2 mighty warships, I would have taken them out to sea off Kota Bharu, the army's invasion point on Malaya, and attacked. While we were standing by, waiting for orders to take off in the event of enemy action, we received word that our transports were moving into Kota Bharu,